Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and I got to tell you, when the legislative session ended earlier this year, I expected the rest of the summer to be a little boring. Honestly, in the life of somebody who writes about North Dakota politics, this was supposed to be my slow period, but then Doug Burgum came and decided to launch a presidential campaign, which he's actually in Fargo doing that as I'm recording this. By the time you hear this podcast, he will have officially announced. He actually filed his FEC paperwork earlier this morning, and he's running. And here to talk with me about that is a guy who covers these national presidential races for a living, Dave Weigel, formerly of the Washington Post, now of Semaphore, which is a by the way, a great outlet. I actually interviewed Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief and founder, one of the founders of Semaphore, earlier in an earlier show, but now Dave's on to talk a little bit about North Dakota's governor running for president. And Dave, I got to say that the biggest reaction I've seen at the national level is, I guess, kind of a joke. Doug who? Everybody seems to be saying. I got to tell you, as somebody who's watched this guy locally, and, you know, I'm a hometown guy. I'm a North Dakota guy, so of course I'm going to have a bias in that regard. But I got to tell you, don't bet against Doug Burgum. I mean, don't underestimate him. And that's not me saying he's anything but a long shot. He's a long shot, but I think this guy might have more legs than people give him credit for. What are you seeing from the national level?
Well, thanks for the intro. And actually, you and I were at the convention in 2016 where my recollection is people know who Doug Burgum was. The Attorney General was a favorite.
He took third.
Governor.
He took third at that at that state convention when he was running for governor. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm in the don't underestimate him camp. But I think you accurately characterize the way the national media use him. And I'll be blunt about it. The national media likes to have its back scratched and likes to be introduced to somebody before they start running for president. And what's happened with Governor Burgum, he just has not done the sort of Chris Sununu style, put me in your green room, put me on your TV show, let's sit down at this convention in D.C., backpatting with the D.C. and New York media. Of which I am part. So he's not well known for that simple reason. And then, frankly, that North Dakota, like many states that don't happen to have an ocean next to them, just don't get the same kind of coverage. So a lot of national media are meeting him for the first time. And I think the more serious analysis of why they think he has a tough path of nomination is they just don't see what the lane is for anyone who's not Ron DeSantis. Not mentioned. You and I will talk about what we think what the governor thinks that lane is. Right. But it's taken a while people to adjust to this for the reasons I just mentioned. Like, who is this guy? I've been going to Republican Governor Association meetings for years. I recognize that guy who was dressed differently, dressed more like a tech CEO than a governor. But people didn't know him until today.
Yeah, well, and let's be honest, he does have a long road. This is a long shot. I mean, there's no question about it. Being from North Dakota doesn't help him very much. We are nowhere near a major media market. We have exactly 3 electoral votes. We are never a swing state. He doesn't have some of those built-in advantages that a governor from a place like Florida, for instance, has built in, where they have a big populous state. There's a lot of electoral votes there. There's a much bigger media market. So, those are things that are working against him. But let's talk about that. You brought it up. What's his lane here? Because his first announcement is he's talking about his business success. He's got a great story. I mean, we're familiar with it here in North Dakota. Nationally, people are being introduced to it. It is a great story. I mean, he started a multi-billion-dollar company in North Dakota, a multi-billion-dollar tech company in North Dakota. That's a cool story, but we're talking about the Republican base right now, and I don't know that they want competent businessman. I kind of feel like they want somebody who's a showman. They seem to want culture war, right? I mean, you look at the two front runners, it's Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, and Ron DeSantis is a culture warrior. Donald Trump's a culture warrior. Doug Burgum is going to be the alternative to that. Is there an appetite for that among Republicans?
Yeah, and the way you're describing the governor, there are not really any Republicans with that exact profile. So the first thing is that nobody else comes to this race with that quick elevator pitch. I'm a successful businessman who completely made it on my own, and I've been the governor of a state who's passed conservative bills. There's really not a conservative litmus test that I think you'd get from a voter in Iowa or New Hampshire that the governor has not passed. Now, has he been around the country speaking at conferences with journalists in the back of the room explaining that? He has not. But if you're going to, for example, a governor who did get a lot of media attention, Kristi Noem, had a very negative experience in 2021. She was kind of reintroducing herself as a potential national figure. I'd say the back of the envelope read on her for a lot of conservatives is she bungled the biological males transgender bill, and in South Dakota seemed to be bowing to pressure from NCAA. This is like an issue that Governor Burgum handled pretty quickly and nimbly. So yeah, that's the irony here. It's a governor who was just very quiet, efficient, got what he wanted done, and got there by his own bootstraps. That story needs to be told, but people don't know it yet. That's part of the idea. And in terms of what they want from Warrior, I was on the trail with DeSantis in Iowa last week and over the weekend. And frankly, the stuff I hear from Iowans is that they want to know as much about his fights with the left. They've appreciated the fight with Disney, the uncompromising fight with Disney. But there are more Republican voters than the ones who people think can decide the nomination, who want those conservative values, but have their concerns about a politician who goes in and fights and drives up the salience of an issue. It makes people angry, makes them protest in the streets. This is, I think, a less spoken part of people's exhaustion with Donald Trump is, while he was president, saw the peak of protests right in the streets. That's when we saw mass resistance to his policies, the biggest rallies in American history. The idea of a lower key candidate is not crazy for Republican voters. That, okay, I want in their view, I want to believe that you are actually going to do what you say, and you're not going to bow to the left when somebody threatens you or gives you a big check. But I don't necessarily need you to be obnoxious. That's the sort of voter that I think one of his issues, as many, is that I'd say 4 or 5 other Republicans are going for that same voter.
Well, we're going to see what he has to say when he's going to clamber up on the stump for the first time here in about 30 minutes. And again, by the time people are listening to this podcast, he will have made his announcement, and we're going to get some early indication. But so far, what we're hearing from him is he's counting on sort of a silent majority that is tired of a lot of the things that you were just talking about. They're tired of the chaos. They want somebody who doesn't have the baggage. But still, he's got a name ID problem. I mean, he's registered, and to be clear, he is registered, period, in exactly one national poll so far. And granted, it's still very early on in his campaign, but he's got 1% in one CNN poll. Most of the national polls coming out don't even list him as a candidate. Those that do, he's coming in at 0%. What does he got to do, Dave, to break through? I mean, what's the approach? I'm not sure that just standing on the side and say I'm the alternative. I wrote a column earlier this week saying I think he's got to go right after Donald Trump. I mean, he's in this. I think a problem a lot of Republicans have, and Chris Christie's been talking about this. Where he's saying, well, these Republicans who are running against Trump, they don't say his name. I'm going to say his name. I kind of felt like that might be the right approach to Doug Burgum. Now, Doug Burgum's no Chris Christie. Chris Christie has a very unique rhetorical style, but I think there may be something there where if Doug Burgum wants to immediately, kind of climb out of this hole of name recognition that he has, I feel like he's got to go right after Donald Trump. What do you think?
Well, he would have to be careful about that. There's a point that Dave Kokel, the Iowa Republican media consultant who worked for Jeb and learned a lot of lessons from Jeb. The point he makes is that if you're a Republican voter, you ignore a lot of what is said about Trump, at least negative stuff, because you've built up antibodies. As far as you know, everything that's said about him is fake. It comes from media, it comes from, Russiagate. It is very hard to penetrate their headspace with something about Donald Trump that's negative. What you can do is explain that he lost some big fights. How can you win those fights that he lost? I think that's when DeSantis has been effective. It's been about that. It's been, I won on some issues that he didn't win on. Now, he's been too subtle, but I think there's probably a more direct way to do it. And I think talking about winning is the way into it. I mean, this is Donald Trump's vulnerability that a lot of Republicans have just let hang out there. One that I think was more obvious right after the midterm and then faded is that he doesn't win stuff. I mean, he won the presidency once, and then there was a mediocre midterm in 2018. He lost 2020. A much worse midterm than Republicans expected in 2022. You can tell the Doug Burgum story, and I think a lot of Republican governors that they're not running for president tell this story, is, all right, well, while that was happening, look what I was able to do. Look how I won. Look what I passed. Look at that. How I'm bringing down the state's tax rate. Look at the bills I passed. Look at the crisis I navigated. Look how I did it with this gigantic landslide of a lot of Democrats coming out and voting for me too. I mean, he ran ahead of Donald Trump. He could say that about both of his races. So I think that's more the way to do it. I'm just not clever enough to find the way that no Republican has figured out to contrast Donald Trump on something else and not just be branded by a Republican voter as one of those guys who's going to be like all these DC swampers. Fairly or unfairly, I think mostly unfairly. For a lot of candidates, if they just say factual things about the legal trouble Trump is in, people tune out. So I think it's talking about winning in the record and getting out there in a different mold than Trump did. I mean, Trump has had this appeal of being a Queens guy, turned Manhattan guy, very brash, take on every fight with liberals. The story of a successful bootstrap Midwesterner is one that appeals to a lot of people, especially the first state's going to vote in Iowa. That's potentially very appealing, and that's what they think here. It's like, look, there's just a great story of who this guy is, how he wins, and how he wins without alienating the other side. And I think he does have an advantage that he hasn't talked about Trump very much. I mean, that's the final thing I'd say about that is that one problem for Nikki Haley, who worked for Trump, is that she gets twisted knots on when she'll criticize him, what he was wrong about, what he was right about. She really just differentiates herself on spending January 6th in Ukraine, and that's it. So I think Burgum picking some ways to differentiate himself would be helpful to that voter that we're talking about. I mean, if he wanted to get in the media and get a ton of coverage, absolutely, he should go right where, pick up the mic, Chris Christie, and start bashing. I don't think that would help him though.
So what do you think? What do you think he has to do to prove that his race has legs? And I was kind of looking at it. Obviously, like do well in Iowa. I mean, that's the first state. But even before that, I mean, there's going to be a Republican debate coming up here in Milwaukee, and to be in that debate, you have to have, I think it's like 40,000 individual donors, and you have to have shown up in the polls, like 3 national polls. Or have performed well in some of the early states. So I guess, Dave, does he have to make that first debate? Like if he doesn't make that first debate stage, is it over for him?
I would say almost over for him. And what he can do is spend a lot of money, which he has in Iowa, to introduce himself. That's what Tim Scott's doing. Tim Scott's doing this with donors floating a super PAC. Governor Burgum is doing it with some of his own money. He introduced himself to Iowa because the technical rules here are that candidates need to have 40,000 donors. They need to be polling at or above 1%, either in a national poll or in a combination of early state polls. And Iowa, I think, is the best shot he has at that. It's also the most frequently polled state. Now, one little sidebar caveat here I'd say is that campaigns don't control when public polls are released. Kirsten Gillibrand, who ran for president in 2020 as a Democrat, spent, I think, $1.5 million, I remember covering this, on ads in Iowa, hoping that in that threshold before a debate, in that little window, there'd be a poll that shows her at 1%. She would make it, and there just wasn't one. And I think if you're starting now, the debate is in August. It's after the Iowa State Fair. There's going to be at least a Des Moines Register poll around the Iowa State Fair. So I think it would be getting into that poll through a lot of advertising and a lot of work in Iowa. I think flitting around the country and not focusing on one state would not help him. And doing a lot of media, frankly, would help. Vivek Ramaswamy has helped himself from absolutely zero name recognition as a politician to a position in the debates. I mean, he said he has enough donors, and he definitely has polled high enough. I don't think attitudinally the governor is much like Ramaswamy. He's not going to be picking every single fight, but being accessible, getting in the conversation every time on some big issues, that would help. I mean, people you just need to hit this threshold where people think that you're serious. And I covered so much of this in 2020 with Democrats, a little bit in 2016 Republicans, where people with presidential resumes that would make perfect sense. Let's say everybody else caught the flu and they were the nominee. Steve Bullock would have made a lot of sense. John Hickenlooper would have made a lot of sense. And they could not carry over in a crowded field. This is a very different race with it's Trump, it's DeSantis who has some issues, and then it's a bunch of people saying, well, if you don't like them, I'm offering success and electability and a good story. He needs to get in that zone, get to 1%. That's simple as it is. He needs 40,000 people to say, I like that guy who's polling at 1%. I'm going to give him $5.
Yeah, and it seems I kind of feel like he needs a moment too, and this.
Yeah.
His big obstacle, obviously name recognition, but that could change very quickly. And I'm thinking of some people like Ben Carson, right? Or
right.
Like Joe the plumber. And I realize I don't mean to compare Doug Burgum to some of these just kind of marginal people or whatever. Although Ben Carson went on obviously to serve in the Trump administration, but they kind of had a moment that propelled them. So the name recognition thing, if you do it can be overcome very quickly. And maybe Doug can do it. I don't know. We're going to find out. Last question, Dave. I heard Governor Sununu. You brought him up earlier. He has now said he's definitely not joining, and he and he's also sounding. I remember like several months ago, he was very certain that Donald Trump was not going to be the nominee. He's sounding less certain now. He seems to have shifted a little bit about that. He's also decided definitively that he's not getting in the race, and he said essentially, there's too many people getting in, and you're going to get in, and you're going to split the anti-Trump vote or the against Trump vote, and that's just going to hand Trump the victory. And I guess you could look at that as a criticism of Doug Burgum getting in. I've heard people make that argument. He's a little known. He's a long shot. He's little known. All he's doing by getting into this race is helping Donald Trump. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, it's mostly about Iowa. I don't think there's much of a path forward for Burgum if he does not. Well, one, if he doesn't get into this debate. Two, if he doesn't place pretty well in Iowa. And pretty well would be, I used to be in the top three. Amy Klobuchar kind of broke the mold because she came in fifth place, and just because she was clever about how she spun it, she got a couple more weeks at bat. But he needs to place well in Iowa and become the Trump alternative. This is the problem that they're all dealing with. I think it was not total realism about what the situation is. But I think maybe I have not been clear enough about it. The thing that people like Governor Burgum, Chris Sununu, like a lot of people just think that DeSantis is not going to wear well with a large national audience, and that he is too abrasive. He's too not just conservative, but conservative in a way that accentuates the negative parts of what he's doing, the ones that anger most people, doesn't accentuate the positive parts. And I think this with DeSantis, where he will talk about ban. He took off the sales tax for baby products, for diapers, cribs, etc. Like nobody pays attention to the second part because he's so focused on the other. So Burgum just needs to be that guy who people take seriously as the Trump alternative is more electable. And yeah, to the extent there's five of the guys in that lane, I think a lot of the questions he's going to get throughout the race are, why are you still in this? Are you going to drop out? So that his paradox is that he needs to do enough to get into that debate, and when people have a lot of attention, it happened before. It happened to Carly Fiorina, it happened to Kamala Harris, but those are two people who did not become the nominee. People who had people paid attention. Could they convert that into something else? That is his strategy. Also, the only strategy, not strategy. It's kind of the Penn strategy. It's a little more fraught. Yeah, that's the same thing going on. So it's not a simple answer. He needs to he is at the moment one of the candidates splitting up the I don't like Trump vote. And you take all them out of the polls, you put one of them against Trump, it's close. If you put all those alternatives against Trump, it's not. Trump is leading pretty decisively. So he needs, I think, both to break out in ways that are hard to do, and he needs might be easier for some other people to flop.
Yeah, well, I mean that may be the case, and again, I mean we're talking about a situation where Doug Burgum is consistently polling at 0%, and Donald Trump, meanwhile, is leading the rest of the field by 30 points. I mean, that is, things can change quickly, but Burgum's betting on it, and I've heard people say this. He's betting that there's an appetite out there for a not Trump that I'm not sure it exists, honestly, David. I don't know if there is enough Republicans out there who want to move on. And I think really that's what it's going to take. It's going to take Trump supporters wanting to move on, and then at that point, it's anybody's race. I'm not sure that they do.
No, it's tough. I agree with you. I do think his story and the business record is an advantage that nobody else has. I mean, Tim Scott has been in politics his whole life. Nikki Haley's been, should emphasize how much she was an accountant, but it's been a long time. The fact that he can talk about his story in North Dakota, I think it can resonate because, look, a lot of the country, this is a huge factor that helped Trump, as you know, a lot of the country are never going to live on the coast. They're never going to have these, easy email jobs that you can get in New York or Los Angeles. And the idea of somebody coming up from a small town, North Dakota, and making really good and saying that you can do it too, that is powerful. That gets you kind of perked up and listening. And no one else has that.
And it's real too.
There's a lot more to do, but then the story.
And it's a real story too. It's not a made up one, which is always advantageous. David, thank you so much for coming on and making time, and certainly looking forward to Governor Burgum's announcement and seeing how all of this plays out.
Absolutely, Rob. Good to talk to you.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Well, I recorded actually the first part of this podcast with Dave Weigel before Governor Doug Burgum's event. Now that event has happened. I'm sure a lot of you listening to this watched it. Somebody who was in the room for the event was, of course, my co-host Ben Hanson. And Ben, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. Trying to cool off now. There are a lot of human beings in that room, and it was hot. Hot to the point where a couple of people had to be escorted out even, and not to blame that on the event planners. It was packed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is history. I mean, whatever you think of Doug Burgum, you're for him, you're against him, you're lukewarm about him. It's not very often. In fact, just only one other time in history that a North Dakotan, an actual North Dakotan, not somebody who was, born here like Gary Johnson, was born in Minot, but he left when he was 5. And ran for president. It's not very often it happens that somebody from North Dakota runs for president, so it's historic, and I understand why a lot of people wanted to be in there. What did you think of the of the announcement? And you and I were texting back and forth some reflections on it as we went, and I know you're still kind of there, which is why people are hearing voices and stuff in the background.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
No problem at all. But we my reaction to it was fine. It could have been curated a little bit more. I think that Doug Burgum it was very much a North Dakota event. And I realize I want to preface some of this understanding that you and I are not necessarily the target audience of the event today. People in North Dakota know Doug Burgum. We heard a lot of stuff we already know. His target audience is a lot of people outside of North Dakota who don't know this guy yet. And so, yes, it sounds like he's recycling a lot of stuff we've been hearing about Doug Burgum for years, but we got to remember there are millions of people in this country who haven't heard that stuff. So I get it. I'm not the target audience for this. That being said, I felt like it could have been curated a little bit more. We had some people on stage. I didn't really know who these people were. There were a couple of laugh lines, but it could have been better. The most noteworthy thing for me, didn't mention Donald Trump or really any of the other Republican candidates for president at all. Did talk about Joe Biden and some of those policies, as you would expect. And I thought the speech was a little bit of a slog. It picked up at the end, but the whole event was, I think it wasn't as tight and packaged for a national audience as it could have been.
So the energy in the room was high, and if your first hurdle is making sure you have hometown support, he definitely got that. And the CNN was there, Reuters was there. They can interview, the local person in the cafe and say, this person grew up with him. I have family that live out in Arthur, North Dakota, where Doug Burgum's from, and I actually got to meet a lot of other people that happen to know my family there to show you how local the event was, which is not inherently a bad thing. But to your point, the first couple speakers I was unaware of, and even at the beginning of Governor Burgum's speech, there were a lot of North Dakota specific name dropping that, to me, I'm a bit confused.
Yeah.
Say you're a GOP voter, primary voter rather, who's politically active-ish, and you live in Ohio or Tennessee or Wyoming. You don't happen to know who Doug Burgum is, so you tune in online, because this was broadcast online, to hear, who is this guy? Is he my alternative to Donald Trump? And you get a half hour of speakers who are talking some really small town stuff. And that was the theme, was going, we need America to run more like a small town, or I'm a small town guy. It was very much a country song of a theme. It's not the worst idea to bring up once on stage, but I just, in this attention deficit media landscape, are you really watching this for more than 5 minutes and that's again, as a dedicated GOP voter, let alone trying to bring about persuasion. I actually, to your point, don't really think many of the Joe Biden talking points were, maybe I'm just playing man in a high tower and waving my finger, but I don't feel like they were specific enough. If I'm Doug Burgum and I've had 4 sessions under my belt, why wouldn't you rattle off the top 3 things that have inhibited industry in your state via, what in his opinion, and say, I was sick and tired of that, and that's why I'm running to be chief executive. Instead, he just says the same. Here's the deal. I was a Democratic state legislator. I could go up and give a speech about how much I hate red tape, I hate bureaucracy, and I want to unleash the economy. In fact, I just did it. Those are the 3 talking points. Anybody can say those things. There was what's the distinction?
I think he needed to give the national audience, and in particular the national media who were going to deliver this event to a national audience, he needed to give them something to grab onto, a line or a moment. And I'm not sure he did it. We're going to see what the reaction was. There was a point early on. I mean, for those of us who are veterans of North Dakota political events, there is a trope, a cliche at the beginning where the keynote speaker, whatever, the candidate, is going to just go around and introduce everybody in the room. And there was a moment where Doug Burgum was doing that. And it was such a quintessential North Dakota event where you're campaigning in a place where everybody already knows each other. And so we're all introducing each other in this room to one another. And it was just like, Doug, don't do that. You're on a different stage now. Stop it. And let's move on. It
didn't feel any different than a standard North Dakota. Well, okay, let me put it like this. I went to Doug's announcement that he was running for governor in January of 2016 when we were all very certain he was going to lose to Stenehjem. And we went, people like me went, who weren't necessarily Republicans in that case, because a lot of us had known him for years downtown. The invite was sent out, was cast a wide net. And when we watched it, I don't know, I'm sure you remember it, Rob, it was an hour long, and it was very much a TED Talk. It was what he would present at a business conference in order to run for governor. And there were a lot of politicos who kind of snickered and said, that's not what you do to run for governor. And then, the results showed us. Now, did that announcement have anything to do with his subsequent campaign? Frankly, no. Frankly, I think it was a lot of dollars spent on TV. This one might be analogous. We're watching this going, this is what you do when you're the governor of North Dakota. This isn't what you do when you're a national candidate. But maybe it just doesn't matter because he runs hard-hitting ads in Iowa and New Hampshire that actually make a distinction between him and Donald Trump, or actually gives a reason to run that isn't, I'm a small town guy, I'm a business success. There needs to be one more step that says America urgently needs blank, and America doesn't necessarily urgently need someone who did well in the software sector. That doesn't have urgency behind it.
To your point, I mean, Doug Burgum's wealth is going to matter in this race, and the fact that he also knows a lot of wealthy people. I mean, let's not forget Bill Gates himself donated to Burgum's gubernatorial campaign. I know in the 2016 cycle, I don't know if he made another donation in 2020. He may well have. I'd have to go back and look. I don't remember. But, Doug can bring to bear a lot of money, both his personal wealth and he has some big contacts. Granted, getting donations from Bill Gates probably isn't going to be very helpful in a Republican primary where Bill Gates is something of a bête noire to a lot of those people. But let me just, I got some numbers. Donald Trump has raised $18 million so far, as of March 31st, 2023.
Right.
Vivek, I always forget how to pronounce this guy's last name. Ramaswamy.
I actually don't know. And
he's raised 11.4 million. Nikki Haley's at 5.125 million. Tim Scott's at 1.6 million. He just got in.
Ron's at 20, and
right,
that's because he has leftovers from his governor's campaign.
Tim Scott has 21 million in cash on hand because I think he's got some other stuff going. That's just what he's raised this cycle. Trump has 13 million in cash on hand. Those are numbers that I think Doug Burgum is very capable of reaching in terms of fundraising. And
I mean, honestly, he doesn't need to reach it. He can actually write himself a check for $20 million.
So
he can.
He could. But I think he's going to have plenty of donors. So the thing is, he can get there and he can make a big splash on advertising right away and all the different marketing that's going to raise, hopefully you would hope if he does it right, raise his ID. And to me, that's the thing. I do think he's got to get better on the stump. And there's going to come a point where he's going to have to talk about the other candidates in the field. And the most important person to talk about, or maybe the most important two people to talk about, are the two front runners, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, because
and is he going to be comfortable going outside of his comfort zone of talking about his biography, talking about small town North Dakota, and throwing an actual punch? Because in his campaigns, his punches were thrown on TV ads.
Right, his punches were thrown on, and I think he's going to have to do it in person. Like he's going to have to go a little bit. And granted, his style is not Chris Christie. But he's going to have to go after these guys a little bit. I don't know another way. Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis together consistently have 3/4 of the polling numbers. You're not going to win this race without pulling some people away from them.
And the most analogous Midwestern political figure I can think of who's recently ran for president is, to me, clearly Tim Pawlenty. And I thought Tim Pawlenty actually, frankly, had a better story to tell. I'm a red state. I'm a Republican governor that cut a lot of spending, I cut a whole bunch of red tape, whatever, in a otherwise fairly blue state. Doug Burgum's narrative is, I got elected as a Republican in North Dakota. Woo! That's like Gavin Newsom coming on saying, elect me as your nominee. I managed to make it as a Democrat and stay in North Dakota.
There's a question. I mean, Tim, and even Tim Pawlenty's problem is I was an effective governor. Is that enough? We seem to have an electorate that wants to be.
Of Tim Pawlenty? Nobody cared.
Right.
Nobody cared.
Right.
Neighboring Iowa, the man shared a border with Iowa, and Iowa didn't give a darn about him.
So
now. What is going to be interesting with Doug is he did that tour of North Dakota where he went to every town of more than 1,000 people. Now maybe dial that up to every town of more than 10,000 people in Iowa. Be interesting if he just media blitzed it, and I'd really be curious to see.
And he's good. He's good on the stump. He's good in a room. I mean, you put him in a room, he's going to connect with people. And in Iowa, that's going to matter. My previous guest, Dave Weigel, he said it's all about Iowa, and I agree. And the one thing I would add to that, it's all about Iowa, and it's also all about making that first debate in August. Because if he doesn't make that first debate in August, I think it's over.
I disagree. That's all about Iowa. Who won Iowa in 2016? Ted Cruz. Who won Iowa in 2008?
It's all about Iowa. Well, you see, but the thing is Burgum's got to survive. Like he can't when you're at 0% and your name. Ted Cruz wasn't at 0% name ID. Burgum's got to survive past Iowa, so he's got to at least do something in Iowa to convince people that to build on the momentum. Who wins Iowa is not necessarily who gets the presidential race, but people who bomb in Iowa definitely don't continue. So he can't afford to bomb in Iowa.
Buzzsawed in South Carolina, absolutely buzzsawed by either Trump or Scott, and I'm guessing it's actually Trump.
Well, you got Haley's from South Carolina too. So you have Haley and Scott, who are both hometown people in South Carolina, and then Trump, who's very popular there.
And I don't know how he rocks New Hampshire. I don't see the route here, but given Donald Trump's very explicit statements about, these people running against me aren't going to get cabinet positions, maybe I can hang up that whole theory that he's running to be Secretary of Energy or Secretary.
I think a lot of people are saying that. I think that's a common thing because it is true. A lot of people run for president because they want to use, they want to try to absorb some support out on the campaign trail and then use that as leverage to sell books or get big speaking engagements or get an ambassador appointment or a cabinet appointment or something like that. I don't think
Pete Buttigieg is doing it right now. Secretary of Transportation.
That's exactly what Pete Buttigieg
in Grand Forks. And he's going to run for president against somebody. He did very successfully.
That being
by
said,
the way, won Iowa at the end of the day, but couldn't get that nomination.
But as somebody, I guess, I don't know. I look at Doug Burgum. I think it's unfair to say. I think that's the cynical thing to say. I don't think Doug Burgum gets into something like this without an eye towards winning. That doesn't mean he maybe won't settle for something down the road. But I think it's two things. I think Doug Burgum's he's either gonna win the nomination, or at some point it's going to be clear that his campaign's going nowhere. He folds up the tent. He runs for governor again. I think it's going to be one of those two things.
I completely agree with you. I'm guessing it's going to be the latter. Here's something that I found interesting that might not matter in the long run. The room was surrounded by a lot of familiar people. The room was filled with familiar people within the North Dakota political scene, from the Arthur and rural Cass County scene.
There were two governors there. Ed Schaefer was in the audience. Jack Dalrymple was in the audience.
And a lot of Republican legislators, too, contrary to the narrative that he does not get along with the legislature, which there's a reason for that. But what I thought was interesting, and again, might not mean anything in the long run, is the video that us hardcore politicals have all seen online, the 3.5 one that starts with the woke is what you do at 5 a.m. in the morning gag. That video got cheers at the woke joke, the selling energy to our friends, and there was one other line. I noticed there was no cheers or applause for yelling and screaming isn't going to cut it anymore. We need a different way. And there was there weren't any cheers for, I think it was a small town line. And I noticed the same during his speech. It's interesting seeing what red meat is playing with the audience locally and what isn't. And I'm guessing the more he tries to emphasize that, the yelling and divisiveness isn't going to get it done, I'm really wondering how much the base that he has to appeal to this primary either tunes out or just doesn't care or maybe even disagrees.
To me, that's the big question mark. And the thing is, we were talking about Tim Pawlenty, and Tim Pawlenty was quote unquote boring, which is to say he was merely a very effective, very accomplished governor who got things done working in a state where the political winds were blowing against him as a Republican. He was quote unquote boring. We're also a country, though. I mean, Tim Pawlenty was running in a different era. He was running pre-Trump. We're post-Trump now. And I think, and again,
it worse for Doug. Chances wise.
Well, I don't know. Because what Weigel and I were talking about in the first part of the show and to me, there's a question mark. I'm not saying that there is. But is there an appetite for moving on from the chaos? I think Joe Biden honestly had some wins in his sails because of that. He was seen as a let's get back to normal guy. Could a let's get back to normal guy in Doug Burgum catch fire? I don't know. To me, that's the question mark. I kind of feel like that is his... I feel like that's where he's putting his bet. That's where he's placing his chips, that there is an appetite for a more traditional candidate. Now, being that, I still think he's got to do some stuff. He's got to get his name ID up. He is polling, again, there has been one poll, CNN, from mid-May, where he polled at 1%. Everything else, he's been at 0%. He's got to do something, and I don't know how he does that without throwing some haymakers. He's going to have to do it.
Yeah, I think starting at 0 is, actually, it's fine, because everybody starts at 0. You got to start somewhere. Donald Trump got to cheat because he was a celebrity, which is an unfortunate trend we're all kind of going towards politically. But in order to do that, like you just said, why he needs to get comfortable being controversial. I'm not saying he needs to be fundamentalist. I am certainly not saying he needs to sell out to the worst demons of his party.
Not controversial in the way that Donald Trump is controversial, but he needs to be provocative, I think, in taking that. And I guess, again, that was my argument. Go for Go for Trump's throat. Go straight at him. And I know.
And I completely agree. I think the opening line should have been, I appreciate, or whatever, frankly, BS thing he wants to thank Donald Trump for. And then immediately followed up with, that era is over. We're starting a new chapter. And like, get some gasps in the room to get more headlines, because you're at zero, dude. You can't go any lower.
Yeah, ride. I mean,
negative.
ride Chris Christie's coattails a little bit, right? I mean, some of the stuff that Chris Christie is saying about what he said about Donald Trump last night was great. The guy who crowds the mirror, right? The guy who's not he's not going to be our retribution. The only person he's out for retribution for is himself. He's talking about how Donald Trump is selfish, how he's not accomplished, he's a profligate spender, et cetera, et cetera. Doug could say all those same things. He could follow Chris Christie's lead, and the edge he's got above Chris Christie is he doesn't have Christie's baggage. Chris Christie left the governorship of New Jersey with 7% approval rate amid scandal. Doug Burgum doesn't have that baggage. Doug Burgum doesn't have the baggage of having worked in Trump's administration at one. Well, he was. I get. Chris Christie was the transition. Does that count as being in the administration? I don't know.
I mean, perception-wise, might as well have been.
Sure. So I think, when
you're doing
Burgum
speech prep for the guy, you work for him,
right? So I think that Doug Burgum should go that road. I don't think you and I disagreed on this. I didn't think he needed to do it necessarily today, but I do agree that he needed a gasp line today. He needed something to set him apart, something for the national media to grab on and put in the headline and put in tweets and everything. And I don't know that he delivered that.
If he thinks, and I say he, that's what I was about to say. I'm going to edit myself, because I was about to say the thing that like people attribute all of Apple as a company to Steve Jobs, or all of Microsoft to Bill Gates. If his campaign strategist and he think that he can do what he did for governor in a primary in a frankly low-cost media market state that wasn't expecting a primary challenge because it really hadn't seen too many, he can't do that again in Iowa. And I think he failed to make a mark here. I think he failed to make a blip on the national media today. And you can't make up for that later in Iowa. Yeah. Now it's a further deficit.
He's gonna have to do it.
Ticking against him.
Well, he's got 78 days until he's got to qualify for that first debate. And if he doesn't, again, I think if he doesn't qualify for that first debate, he's got to show people that he's in this race. If he can't qualify for the debate, people are going to write him off. They're already wanting to write him off. The one thing he's got going for him a little bit, and I think everybody think the Doug Who thing is a negative for him. I think right now what is helping him get some headlines is the novelty of a governor from North Dakota running. That is getting him some attention. That's getting his foot in the door in some ways that maybe he couldn't have otherwise. But now, but when people's attention on him, he's going to have to give them something. And he didn't do that today. He's going to have to do it quickly.
He's going to have to make choices in a way that I don't think he's been comfortable with as governor. He's going to come out and say, we don't need to focus on, he's already made implications. We don't need to focus on these hot button social issues. You don't need to, whatever. But the headline is going to be, the factual headline is, you signed a 6-week abortion ban. You signed, XYZ trans bills last session. And when he says, well, I was going to get veto overridden, that's explaining, that's in the weeds. He's not going to look any different than Nikki Haley or Tim Scott or anyone else coming with states with those, specifically abortion ban, when we're talking about trans bills. These are hot button issues that are going to be brought up. And whether fair or not, at the end of the day, he signed them. He signed them into law. And that is those are our facts.
Yeah, but he's also running. He's also running in a Republican primary right now. I mean, it's in the Republican primary. Signing those bills are not. In the Republican primary, his veto of the transports bill in 2021 is more of a liability than the bills he signed this
Correct,
session.
But then he has to explain that. So he's in this explainer mode instead of narrative setting mode.
Well, that's why go on offense. Go on offense against Trump. Talk about how much Trump spent. Talk about Trump's scandals. Talk about all of the problems that Trump has created for our country and all the baggage. And talk about the fact that Trump is a loser. He couldn't beat Biden in 2020. Republicans had terrible midterms in 2018 and 2022. A lot of that is attributable to Donald Trump.
But people don't care. I agree with you as a strategist. People don't seem to care. Tim Pawlenty, I'm sorry, I keep going back to that well. The man won a re-election as governor in 2006. Do you remember how bad 2006 was 2006, for
2006 was 17 years ago.
Yeah, it was an absolute bloodbath.
It was a different political world. I don't think Tim Pawlenty is as relevant in this moment as it is. But again, that to me, and I said it before, that's the big question mark with Doug Burgum is there an audience out there for somebody who doesn't have Trump's baggage or doesn't have, or even DeSantis's baggage, where DeSantis is now in this ugly feud with Disney. And
he keeps interacting with people, and the more Ron DeSantis interacts with people, the more people see Ron DeSantis interacting with people, and it's very bad.
Right. So I don't know. There's an opportunity for Doug Burgum. I am not in the just write him off. And again, something else I brought up with Dave Weigel, and this will be our last little point, is that it's easy to go viral, right? And I'm thinking about. Yeah. Look at like somebody like Joe, and this is not me comparing Doug Burgum to Joe the Plumber, but you remember Joe the Plumber and how much how much legs that got. You remember Ben? Ben Carson. Look at how much juice Ben Carson got out of like one speech.
No, I think that is going to be what happens to Doug Burgum. He's going to be a flavor of the week for 2 weeks. All of Fred Thompson, Ben Carson, that one anti-immigration guy from Colorado whose name I can't remember anymore. He probably represented Lauren Bobert's district.
Was it Tancredo?
Yeah. Starts with a T and ends with an O. I know that much. They all had their 2 week spotlight in the sun, and then I think that was the year that McCain got the nomination. I think Doug Burgum will say something. He'll do something like he did when he teared up about masks. And some people are going to say, wow, this guy's really human. It might be something to do with First Lady Catherine Helgesbergum's
who did very well treatment. On the stump. By the way, she's going to be an asset, I think.
I thought she did better than Doug.
I did too, frankly. I think she came off as more polished. Yeah.
If Doug would just come out and do the uncomfortable part first, take the big gulp and just throw the elbow, make everyone gasp, and then turn around and start doing the small town dad jokes thing, I think it would shock everyone awake, and then everyone would say, wow, he's kind of funny. I like that. No, I'm not talking about actual policy that we need to make the country better, but he didn't talk about any of Joe Biden's policies in particular today.
I have always told Doug that the most interesting version of him is him and not the character he ends up playing on the campaign trail a lot. When I've talked to him, and he's to the extent that he even wanted my opinion about it. So anyway, that's where we're at. I agree. He's going to have to do something. And again, I say go for it. Like if you're in this race, you're going to spend millions and millions of dollars on it. If you're in it, friggin' go for it, right? Like this mealy mouth, marbles in my mouth. I don't want to talk about Trump. I don't want to be too. Spit the marbles out of your mouth and go for it. Otherwise, why are you in the race? If you're not going to do it, why are you in the race?
I will say a big positive. I hope that comes out of this. God forbid if Kristi Noem actually jumps in too. Is I would love the idea for people who are competent elected officials from states that have less than 15 electoral votes to start running for president routinely. Because right now, as far as I can tell, the DNC is interested in being a political party in about 17 states on presidential election years. It's tiring. I'm not going to speak to what the RNC wants to do, but every presidential election, we get to do the same song and dance. And it started to change because of demographics, but everybody gather and only talk about Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. Now we kind of talk about Virginia. Now Georgia's there, but it's 6 states, and it sucks. I would love to talk about other places in the country. I would love to hear someone talk about the manufacturing base in Alabama. I would love to hear about how dairy farms impact the egg industry coming out of Vermont. Red, blue, take your pick. We need to stop limiting it. And if Doug Burgum does open that up, that's definitely.
But again, the public needs to want it, though. The public needs to want it, and they need to want a competent person who's going to talk about serious policy issues like energy, like a lot of the economy, like border security, like a lot of these other things that Doug was talking about. We're going to need that.
We are a North Dakota political show, so I must mention, as if Doug, I don't know how far along Doug has to go. It's June, before someone else, Lieutenant Governor Tammy Miller, was there today. How much longer does this need to go on before someone in the GOP announces for governor?
Yeah.
Who isn't named Doug Burgum? Is it Drew Wrigley?
Well, we have a lot of time for that. I think we're gonna know about Doug's presidential campaign one way or the other. Because again, that first debate's August. I think if we get into like November, December, and Doug's still running for president, that's when you're going to see some of these Republicans, like a Drew Wrigley or a Tammy Miller or somebody who might be interested. And I'm saying this, I think Tammy Miller's probably interested in running for governor. Drew Wrigley just got elected attorney general. I don't know what his appetite is. I know at one time he wanted to be governor. I don't know if that's changed. But never
an opening like no incumbent. I can't imagine
that's true.
Passing that up.
That's true. So, I think if we get to like November, December, right. I think if we get there, I think you're going to start seeing some ambitious North Dakota Republicans start looking at running for governor. But, ramping up a campaign for governor in North Dakota is a much quicker thing than, I don't think it has to start like this summer. But you got to think, it's going to be in the back of a lot of those Republicans' minds, so that's something worth watching. All right, we're going to put a pin in it there. Ben, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thank you, of course, for listening. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.